Dawn is breaking on what might appear to be another ordinary day in an ordinary Army installation. But not today. Today marks the dawn of a new path for the world's greatest fighting force. Today, the way the Army selects its future battalion commanders is about to change for the better. In a few hours, the first of nearly 800 officers will be arriving here. They are coming from every major Army installation in the U.S. and from every major overseas location, from the Middle East to East and Southeast Asia, from Australia to Africa, and beyond. Over 5 days, these officers, mostly majors and lieutenant colonels, will be the first to undergo a new way to determine who are best fit to be the Army's next battalion commanders. But why the change? Historically, the Army has picked its battalion commanders and officers to serve in key billets using a board to review and assign value to an officer's past performance. Much of the information considered in this process, however, relies strongly on the subjective evaluation of a senior raider. And while the insights of this raider's perception of the officer are critical, they're also limited and don't include other relevant information about the candidate. In short, for such an important decision, too much emphasis is placed on too little information. Or, as the Army Chief of Staff recently noted,
right now we spend more time and money selecting a private to be in the Ranger Regiment than we do on selecting what I would argue is one of the most consequential leadership positions in the Army, our battalion commanders.
Meet J.P. McGee, the Army Major General charged with planning and executing the Army's first iteration of the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. General, we are sitting in the General George Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky. I want to start just by asking, what is the significance of having this conversation in this setting?
Well, I think it's a great place to have this interview because I think if you look at George Patton, he was someone who had a unique set of talents. And those talents were used to excel our Army in a direction, both in peacetime and combat, to make us better ready to fight a war like World War II, and then actually win a war like World War II. So for an officer who is imbued with so many talents, it's great to be able to sit here and talk to you in his museum about how we're trying to uncover and find those talents in our officer corps today to make sure we put the right leaders in positions that can help lead our Army into the future.
So, General, tell me, why did the Army decide to change how it chooses its future battalion commanders?
The legacy selection system for battalion commanders in the Army has been tried and true and is a very good process. But when we took a look at it, what we realized is it relies on too little information. It wasn't that the system was bad. It's not. It's actually a very good system, and it's really fair. The question was, is this the very best way that we can pick battalion commanders, this critical position for our Army? And I think when we reviewed it, we said there are probably better ways to do it, to add more additional relevant information that might not be included on the officer evaluation report for us to make this decision for the Army about who we're going to put in charge of the sons and daughters of America.
Organizations in government, industry, and professional sports have demonstrated the power of assessment-based selections to identify the best candidates to fill critical positions. Now the Army is using a similar model, tailored to the enterprise, to select battalion commanders. And like the way it considers any new weapon system or platform, the Army tested it first. You conducted a pilot program last year to validate this way of picking battalion commanders. Can you tell me about that program?
All 27 officers who went through this process said that they thought this was a better way to pick battalion commanders, and the Army needed to institute it. We had a panel of 7 general officers who were the panel members in terms of doing the interview process for the candidates. All 7 general officers who participated in that said this is a better way for the Army to pick battalion commanders, and recommended that we add this as a new function.
The candidates are given 45 minutes to read a professional journal article on a military-related topic. Next, they're given an essay prompt and another 45 minutes to respond to that prompt. General, what is being measured by the written assessment?
So the written assessment is a measurement of a candidate's ability to read an essay and then craft an argumentative essay in support of a thesis. We send the scoring rubric to all the candidates so they know that what we're looking at in terms of their writing requirements. Similarly now, we're adding in a writing assessment, so an objective measure, into the officer corps, so the officer corps will know that if they want to rise to the level of being a battalion commander, it's important for them to do the preparation and work to improve their ability as a writer. That's going to make our communications clearer and better, and it's just going to raise the level of performance across the entire officer corps.
I'm wondering, how does the Army account for maybe some unconventional responses from candidates in the written assessment?
So I think if you look at the scoring rubric, which again we've shared with the candidates, originality and freedom of thought is very much part of that, and it's actually a graded part, so I think it's encouraged.
The writing assignment is the first of a battery of tests that will take place over the 5-day period. Major General McGee gave us insight into the remaining assessments and why they were chosen.
So an evaluation is largely a subjective measure. It is what you decide about your subordinates and how you rank them. And so I've served as a senior rater many times. The Army gives me broad guidance in what we're looking at and tells us that as a senior rater, you're supposed to look at potential. But I have wide discretion in how I determine what potential actually looks like. An assessment is something very different. An assessment, as we define it, is objective, and it's the same and it's consistent. So the one piece that every Army soldier is used to in terms of assessments is the APFT. So every 6 months, the Army requires every soldier to take an Army physical fitness test. It consists of 3 events: push-ups for 2 minutes, sit-ups for 2 minutes, and a 2-mile run. The fact that every soldier in the Army knows they're going to be measured in an objective way on that assessment means that they train and prepare in order to be ready for that test. Similarly, we're going to measure them in their verbal communication skills in a fairly unique way. We're going to take a look at their cognitive, non-cognitive functioning, which is also going to be important. So all of these will require officers, in order to prepare for their selection for battalion command, to improve upon these skills that we think are important to have within the officer corps. And you'll see, I believe, over time, a rise in the level of performance in all of these skills that we want to have within the officer corps, just by including it in the selection process for battalion command.
The Army, slowly but surely, is learning more about the knowledge, skills, and behaviors of each officer, which might not be apparent or noted in the subjective legacy approach. Now that the candidates for battalion command have been tested on written communication and physical fitness, they'll take the cognitive and non-cognitive assessment, a valid predictor for advancement into senior ranks. Dr. Jake Goodwin is a behavioral and social science researcher with the Army Research Institute. Dr. Goodwin, tell us more about these cognitive and non-cognitive tests and how they're used in the BCAP.
The tests are designed to assess the potential of the candidates to perform as a battalion commander, as well as really perform as a senior leader as they move beyond battalion command. The tests have 2 different major components, the cognitive components and the non-cognitive components. The cognitive components measure general cognitive ability as well as some other specific cognitive skills that are really related to strategic leadership. The non-cognitive components measure temperament that's related to performance in these types of positions.
The tests that we're using were developed in the 1990s, is that correct?
That's correct. Back in the 90s, we started to identify attributes that were associated with leadership at senior levels in the Army. And we performed a series of research studies that looked at whether these attributes actually predicted someone's career progression, performance in the different positions, and ultimately their ultimate rank of attainment. These studies actually took place over the course of 20 years. So it took a long time for us to gather the data to be able to see which attributes actually predicted for this. So the tests that we're using here at BCAP assess those attributes.
While the tests these officers take are comprehensive, they don't tell a complete story about the candidates. Major General McGee noted the importance of peer and subordinate evaluations to the process.
So this is the largest attempt to gather peer and subordinate feedback to help the Army make a decision in the history of the Army. What has been different is we have actually chosen who the peers and subordinates are in order to gather that information. So we've gone through the records, we've seen who you've worked with, we've seen who's worked for you, and we've sent them surveys. These surveys were deliberately smaller, so they don't take very long. The goal is for them to take about 10 to 15 minutes to fill out. They're based on different attributes and competencies we would like to see within our leaders. And then there are also a series of questions about whether these leaders possess counterproductive leadership traits and how frequently they actually manifest them.
What do you say to critics who would consider the peer and subordinate evaluations a popularity contest?
I understand where those critics would be concerned about whether you have been unpopular sometimes as a leader, whether that would be something that we would consider. And I also understand that sometimes there's a line between whether you're a hard leader who has high standards or someone who's certainly crossed that line. And where that line exists is fairly subjective. I think it is also fair to be concerned that if somebody had a bad experience, maybe it was a low-performing officer who had to be counseled or didn't receive a good evaluation from that officer officer would tend to use this tool in order to gain some form of retribution on the officer. I can tell you, after seeing hundreds of these surveys and reading through them, that the soldiers that we've asked, the officers that we've asked, have used this tool incredibly responsibly. And the vast majority of the evaluations on our officers who are coming forward for battalion command are tremendously positive. Okay, so that hasn't shown itself. The other piece of this is that information is all contextualized by a group of very experienced panel members. So a major general, 2-star general, 2 brigadier generals, and 2 former brigade commanders, so colonels who have a tremendous amount of experience. They've all led formations, and they understand the nature of leadership doesn't mean you always have to make everybody happy, and it's not a popularity contest. And I think the leaders that are sitting on these panels and making these decisions have proven themselves tremendously capable of contextualizing the information, positive or negative, about any one of the candidates.
Dr. Melissa Wolf is a senior research psychologist with the Center for Army Profession and Leadership. She helped develop the peer and subordinate assessment that provides insight into the leadership effectiveness of the candidates for battalion command. What is the assessment designed to tell us about each candidate?
The assessment is basically going to tell us how the leader operates within the demands of battalion command. So the assessment was specifically designed to capture those key behaviors, competencies, and attributes that are known to predict success in battalion command. And we asked a number of their peers and subordinates how they operate. And so this assessment basically gives us a sense of what are their strengths, what are their capabilities, and what are some of their developmental needs relative to what we need out of our battalion commanders.
Does this assessment help detect toxic leadership?
Well, that's an interesting question. Toxic leadership is something that the Army has been studying for a number of years. And we've actually realized that the phenomenon of toxic leadership is more than just a negative label. It's a series of behaviors, a whole spectrum, from behaviors that are really benign, that people aren't intending to do it, all the way up to really negative behaviors that are abusive, or what's more formerly known as toxic. And Army research has shown that many behaviors on that spectrum can contribute to negative outcomes, such as decreased readiness, decreased unit cohesion, decreased disciplined initiative, things that the Army really cares about for accomplishing the missions. And so, yes, this instrument does assess the frequency with which the candidates engage in counterproductive leadership. But that being said, it's the frequency. If you have a bad day and you yell in the unit or yell at someone or lose your temper, that's not necessarily an indication of consistent counterproductive leadership. That's a bad day.
So what have you learned about BCAP candidates through this assessment?
We have learned that we have a lot of really good lieutenant colonels and major promotables out there who are going through this process. The vast majority of individuals are exhibiting the competencies and behaviors that we need them to. They're effective leaders, they delegate well, they create a clear vision. And we're also learning that our peers and subordinates have a really unique insight into their candidates, which is helping us to provide a really rich understanding of the candidates' capabilities.
To Dr. Wolf's point about using subordinates and peers to assess leadership effectiveness, this is only one of many areas considered during the psychological assessment. And as Major General McGee noted, This is the single largest gathering of operational psychologists in the Army. With me now are three of them. Colonel Jeffrey McNeil is Director of Psychological Applications for the U.S. Army Special Operations Command and lead operational psychologist for the Battalion Commander Assessment Program. Next, Master Sergeant Ivan Vasquez, Senior Operational NCO, and Major Garen Davenport, Lead Operations Officer for the Assessment Program. Each of you have different roles within the psychological assessment portion of the program, but I want to ask some general questions. Colonel, what is significant about this effort on behalf of the operational psychologists?
I think the first thing that stands out in significance is that we have a team of 35 operational psychologists and operational psychology NCOs from across the Army that have come together for this, and it's really unprecedented to have this many psychologists and operational psych NCOs to support an assessment program.
Can you tell me, what is the value to the Army of these psychological assessments?
It's focused on suitability attributes rather than a diagnosis or looking at kind of a mental health assessment. That's the important distinction of what operational psychologists bring.
Major Davenport, can you talk about the leadership reaction course?
So basically came out and there's various events on the leadership reaction course, and we went out and looked at, hey, which of these events is going to be most important and help us get the best glimpse at some of what these candidates do, not only as a leader, but also as a follower. So that's really important. So we've been keeping the data, we've been looking at it. All this data goes to interviewing psychologists.
We're not out here just running any test that we can think of or any assessment just because it's a good idea. Everything's looked at, so if it doesn't make sense or if we're not getting anything of value, there's no sense of putting a candidate through these assessments.
With me is Staff Sergeant Ronnie Morales, Psychology NCO, to further explain the leader reaction course behind us. Sergeant Morales, what are the candidates doing and how does it figure into the assessment?
All right, so what you see these candidates doing here today is tackling some obstacles. So what we're trying to kind of get from these obstacles is how they perform as a leader and as a follower. Some of these obstacles are really challenging. Some of them actually have no solution, have no right answer. Some of them do. We really don't care so much if they're successful at completing the obstacle. We're really more looking at how they engage with their teammates and how they perform as a leader and how they perform as a follower.
I'm catching up with some of the candidates as they complete the LRC. Lieutenant Colonel Ramon Briganti, what are your impressions of the course and the assessment program so far?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity to get a deeper assessment of all the candidates. Typically the board only looks at each file for a very short amount of time, so this goes beyond the paper, and I think it gives the Army leadership a better sense of who we are individually, what our personality traits are, and just how we interact in a social setting.
No assessment for a battalion command posting would be complete without understanding each candidate's leadership capabilities. But what exactly are the psychologists looking for? Major Jess Harmon is one of them. Dr. Harmon, can you tell me what kind of questions the candidates can expect and what you're trying to learn from those questions?
The candidates can expect questions related to their personal and professional backgrounds, their military history, as well as questions about how they perceive themselves and how they interact in their environments outside of BCAP. The purpose of the question is to help the panel members gain information in a limited amount of time to make a decision on their potential for battalion command.
Can you tell me how this assessment differs from other assessments that you've done or that the Army has conducted in the past?
This is not a medical assessment, nor is it a mental health assessment. This is used for purposes of personnel selection for battalion command and future potential.
What value does this program have for the Army?
It allows each candidate an opportunity, more time with the individuals who are making a decision on their future career. And so instead of it being just a packet that's being reviewed, they have the opportunity to sit down and talk through their strengths, their weaknesses, who they are and how they've come here and why it's important for them to move forward. And so I think it gives a candidate an opportunity to share more information as they move forward and a more holistic approach of each candidate as they're being selected for battalion command.
Welcome to the blind panel interview. Depending on your viewpoint, it's either the easiest or the hardest day of the program. The panel is composed of 5 voting members, a 2-star general, 2 1-star generals, and 2 former brigade commanders. There are also 3 non-voting members on each panel, including a panel moderator, a command sergeant major, and a senior psychologist. The panel sits on one side of the partition, The candidate sits on the other. But why a blind interview?
How do you do the best informed process? And we saw a few studies that have been on symphonies. What we found is within symphonies is that when they would audition for new members to join the symphony, they would find that when they would bring someone in, they would have someone play a cello, they would be all evaluated and looked at. The panel members would all vote the proficiency of that cello player in a certain sort of scoring system. But when they erected a screen between them so you couldn't see the player on the other side of the screen, what they found is they made tremendously different choices about who they would pick as a cello player. So we decided to erect that screen in order to see how that would reduce the bias and focus the panel members on really listening to the candidates and then focusing on what we're asking them to evaluate them on, which is their ability to communicate in the verbal form. The other great thing about having that screen between the candidate and the panel is it allows that candidate to be able to speak, I think, more freely about some of the issues that come up, not worrying about looking at the panel members, not being distracted by any of their gestures.
What information does the panel have about the candidates during that blind panel interview?
We try to present the relevant information to the panel members so they can make the best informed decision. So they get a holistic view of the candidate based on the psychometric assessments that have been done and the psychological interview. They are able to look at the peer and subordinate feedback that is incorporated in the file of the candidate. They're able to look in a tiered fashion at how the candidates have done on all the assessments that we ran from them.
Over 100 senior Army officers representing units from around the Army serve on the panel. With me are Major General Paul Calvert, Colonel Joe Locke, and Major General Raul Escribano. So can you tell us how the information on this panel differs from other panels you participated in the past?
There's a lot more information that is provided to you in terms of cognitive assessments that you don't have as a part of the selection board process the way we have done them in the past. I think the information is much richer, but the identity of the officer that is coming before the panel, you don't know. You don't know their background. You don't know their branch. So it's really a blind on blind panel.
In the past, it was all about a file review. This time you get to ask questions. We go back to their behavior at a situation. We see how they behave back in that situation. Then we see how they acted, and then we understand and see how they perform in that particular situation, which helps understand future behavior for the candidates. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for battalion commanders that can perform under a lot of stress, but trying to understand how they're going to perform in the future.
Colonel, can you tell me why you think this process, or if you think it should be used for other selection processes in the future for the Army?
Yeah, I think it's got application there. I'll tell you though, if you think about just the level of importance it is for selecting battalion commanders and the degree of impact that they have on the day-to-day lives of all of our soldiers, if we invest significant amount of time here picking the right guys for battalion command, the pool of people that can command brigades or command at higher levels is much, much higher. So I think if we get this right, it has just second and third order effects that can't even be measured yet.
As the program winds down, we wanted some parting words from those officers who just completed the Army's first Battalion Commander Assessment Program. Major Armstrong, did the program meet your expectations of what you thought it might be?
I mean, most challenging was probably being resilient as each, assessment was administered. So, as you take an assessment, you're obviously going to go back to that, wonder what you could have done better. But at that point in time, you're faced with another assessment. And so it's a matter of continuing to push forward and trying not to look back too much.
Anytime you do one of these courses, especially one of these that is sort of a first for the Army, you expect there's going to be a lot of friction and a lot of hiccups, but it really exceeded my expectations. Highly professional, consistent, and fair across the board. I felt like the sequencing was excellent, and just the professionalism of the NCOs and the officers that ran this program, I was very impressed.
Can you pinpoint over the last 4 days, what was one of the hardest parts?
I think one of the hardest parts was probably some of the lengthy assessments that we did. I mean, they really sort of dig deep into some of the areas, psychological assessments, cognitive and non-cognitive assessments. But these are all great indicators and lots of data that we can collect over time to where we can make better decisions to put the right people in the right places at the right time.
This really looked at the whole person, your emotional side, your physical side, your mental side, and then just, your strengths and weaknesses. So I thought this assessment was much more in depth, much more thorough, and more of a 360-degree approach.
And I think it's definitely a better way to assess battalion commanders, and especially the fact that you're being physically looked at, and then talked to, and all the different metrics and assessments. It definitely gives more depth to some things. So very good.
There's certain things you control. You control your physical fitness and your height and weight. So I mean, you've got to make sure that you do that. The PT test is graded to the Army standard, and I think that was a wake-up call for some folks that weren't maybe used to the standard being graded as the standard.
I think bringing us together, getting us on the same playing field, if you will, is a great way for us to see the transparency with how we're getting evaluated against our peers, and then also for the Army to know that they're getting a uniform product with what we're going through here.
So far, it seems like it's pretty validated. It's very professionally run, and they keep us moving. So there's not a lot of sitting around and waiting, which is good.
Well, this is really my first type of assessment that I've gone through, and absolutely overwhelmed my expectations. It's been extremely efficiently run.
The scariest part of the leader reaction course was just watching a bunch of 40-year-olds trying to negotiate those obstacles. So we're very happy our wives and spouses weren't out there to make fun of us.
Going with a good attitude. Don't dwell on what happens. Continue to push forward, and it'll be fine.
General, tell me about what happens to the candidates after they've completed the course.
Within about 2 months, we believe we'll have a finalized and approved list of an order of merit list for those officers. So about 2 months for the initial results, ready for command and not ready for command, to be approved, and then about 4 months for the actual slating to occur, where officers who are determined ready for command would find out what battalions they would go to.
For those candidates who don't make either list, who are not deemed ready for command, are they at a standstill in their military career at that point?
If it fits within their timeline, they'll have an opportunity to come back next year and compete again to see if they're the right candidate to be a battalion commander. They'll be provided some developmental feedback in order to help allow them to improve over the next year, and then they're allowed to come back and try to be a battalion commander again.
If you want the big picture about the Battalion Commander Assessment Program and how it ties into Army talent management, there's no one better to ask than the Army Chief of Staff, General James McConville. So, Chief, why do you consider this program to be so important for the Army?
I think this program is absolutely critical because battalion commanders that raise the group of the next leaders of the Army, every soldier, every non-commissioned officer, and every officer they touch is a future leader in the Army. The Battalion Commander Assessment Program is a transformational change in the United States Army. It's really going from very good to great. And that's what we need to do. We know in the future we're going to be in a time of great power competition. We must have the best leaders, and this program is going to allow us to put the best leaders into what I consider the most consequential command job in the Army, in battalion command. We're very blessed to have the greatest leaders in the Army, and this process is only going to make us better.
The Battalion Commander Assessment Program is the foothold for a talent management revolution that is sweeping through our Army. It marks a transformational shift in how the Army selects officers to serve in the most consequential leadership positions. And the Army is intent on getting it right. Our soldiers, our Army, our nation depend on it.